The day my brother stood at the head of the boardroom table and announced he was the new managing partner, I was sitting 3 chairs down from him, holding a folder that contained his entire employment file. He didn't know that yet. Nobody in that room did. I've thought a lot about when exactly things started going wrong in my family, and I keep landing on the same moment every time. I was 11 years old. My brother, 2 years older. Louder, always the one my father turned toward first, had broken my grandmother's ceramic lamp, the one she brought from Portugal. He said I did it. My father didn't ask me a single question. He just looked at me and said, "Why can't you be more careful?" That was it. No investigation, no second thought. I was the variable that made sense to blame. I thought about that lamp a lot over the years. I thought about it when I graduated from the Rotman School of Management and my parents came to the ceremony, but spent most of dinner talking about my brother's plans to get into real estate. I thought about it when I got my CPA designation and my mother said, "That's lovely, sweetheart, but accounting sounds so boring, doesn't it?" I thought about it when I moved to Toronto and built something quiet and serious and entirely my own, while my brother moved back home to Vancouver and floated from project to project on my father's goodwill and my mother's blind faith. His name was Nathan. My parents called him their compass. I was never sure what that made me. My name is Serena. I'm 31 years old. I work in corporate acquisitions, which is exactly as boring as it sounds to people who don't understand it, and exactly as powerful as it sounds to people who do. This is what happened. My father built Holbrook Property Management over 23 years. It wasn't a glamorous business. They managed mid-sized residential and commercial properties across the Lower Mainland, collected rents, handled maintenance contracts, dealt with strata disputes. Unglamorous, steady, profitable if you ran it right. My father ran it right for a long time. Then he got older and Nathan started showing up at the office. And things began to drift. I watched from a distance. I flew home for Christmas and Thanksgiving and sat across the table from my brother while he talked about his vision for scaling the portfolio, about deals he was working on, about how the industry was changing and how you had to be bold to stay ahead. My father nodded along. My mother refilled his wine glass. I asked questions, specific ones, about occupancy rates and capital reserves and whether they'd renegotiated the maintenance contracts that I noticed were significantly above market. And Nathan would wave his hand and say, "Serena, not everything is a spreadsheet." My father laughed. That was the sound I had learned to dread more than anything. Not anger, just that easy, dismissive laugh that said, "You don't understand how the real world works." I understood more than any of them knew, because I had been watching Holbrook Property Management for 3 years. Not obsessively, just carefully. The way I watched everything, quietly, without announcing it, building a picture from public filings and the things my father mentioned offhandedly at dinner and the questions he didn't ask Nathan that he absolutely should have. By the fall of that 3rd year, the picture was not good. The company had taken on 2 new commercial properties in Burnaby that were underperforming. Vacancy rates were climbing. There was a line of credit with a credit union in Richmond that had been extended twice. And Nathan, I found this out later through the kind of digging that feels almost embarrassing in retrospect, how easy it was. Nathan had brought in an outside investor, a friend of his named Derek, who had put in $240,000 in exchange for a stake in one of the properties that my father didn't fully understand and definitely hadn't reviewed with a lawyer. The investment structure was aggressive and, depending on how you read the filings, potentially fraudulent, not the kind of thing that would hold up if anyone looked closely. I looked closely. I hired a forensic accountant in Vancouver, a woman named Tara, sharp and thorough, who had done work for a fund I'd consulted for in Calgary. And I paid her out of my own pocket to do a full review of every document I could legally access. It took 6 weeks. When she sent me her report, I read it twice, made a cup of tea, and sat very still for about 20 minutes. Then, I called my lawyer. I want to be honest about something because I think it's important. I didn't start this process wanting to take the company. That wasn't the original plan. The original plan was to flag the irregularities to my father, give him the documentation, and let him make decisions with full information for once instead of through the fog of whatever Nathan had told him. I flew home in October. I sat down with my father at the kitchen table. My mother was at her book club, which felt like a small mercy, and I put Tara's report in front of him. I walked him through it slowly. The investment structure, the line of credit, the vacancy problem. The maintenance contracts that were bleeding money every quarter. My father listened. He looked at the pages. And then he said something I have replayed many times since. You've always wanted to find something wrong with your brother. I asked him if he'd read the numbers on page 7. He said he didn't need to because Nathan had already explained all of this to him and there was context I wasn't aware of. He said the business was going through a transitional period, which was normal. He said Nathan was ambitious, and sometimes ambition looked messy from the outside. I asked him what the line of credit was secured against. He paused, just briefly. Then he said the family home, our family home in Dunbar, the one my parents had owned for 30 years, fully paid off, worth somewhere around $2.1 million in the current market, was sitting as collateral on a business line of credit that Nathan had drawn down significantly. I asked my father when he had signed that agreement. He told me February. I asked if he'd had a lawyer review it. He said Nathan had handled all of that. I drove back to my hotel on West Georgia, and I sat in the parking garage for a while before I went inside. Not because I was sad. I was past sad about my family years ago. I sat there because I was doing math, and the math was pointing me somewhere I hadn't fully prepared myself to go. The line of credit had a renewal date in March. If the company couldn't service it by then, and based on current cash flow, they couldn't. The credit union had the right to move on the collateral, which meant my parents' home. I had about 5 months. I spent those 5 months doing something that in any other context, I would describe as a completely normal part of my job. I identified the distressed debt. I approached the credit union carefully, professionally, through the right channels, and began discussions about acquiring the loan. This is not unusual. Credit unions sell distressed commercial debt all the time. They would rather take 75 cents on the dollar from a credit-worthy buyer than go through the cost and delay of foreclosure proceedings. I am creditworthy. I have been building toward being creditworthy for a long time. The acquisition closed on a Wednesday in January. I was in Toronto. I signed the documents over a video call with my lawyer, and when it was done, I closed my laptop and went for a run along the waterfront in the dark. I now held the debt that was secured against my family's home and the operating company my father had spent 23 years building. I didn't tell anyone. What I didn't fully anticipate was Nathan. I knew he was reckless. I knew he was convinced of his own intelligence in the particular way that men who've never been seriously questioned often are. What I didn't fully account for was the specific flavor of his recklessness. In early February, I got a call from Tara. She'd stayed loosely in contact with the file at my request. She told me that Nathan had submitted financial documents to an investor, a new one, someone he was trying to bring in to refinance the line of credit, and that she'd seen copies of those documents circulating through a mutual contact. She said, "Serena, I think he may have altered these." I asked her to send them to me. I pulled up the original bank statements from the company's operating account, the ones I had from the debt acquisition process, which were source documents from the credit union. Then I opened Nathan's versions. They weren't subtle changes. The man had increased the revenue figures by roughly 30%, which, if you knew what you were looking at, was immediately obvious in the way the numbers interacted with each other. The formatting was also slightly off, different font rendering on the numerical columns, a tell that Tara spotted immediately. She said it looked like someone had edited a PDF in Acrobat and hadn't quite matched the source formatting. What Nathan apparently did not know, could not have known unless he had done more than 5 minutes of due diligence on this investor, was that the new investor he was pitching was a holding company connected to a fund whose debt I had just acquired. He had submitted falsified financial documents to my deal team. I forwarded everything to my lawyer that night. She was quiet for a moment and then said, very carefully, "You understand, this is wire fraud." I told her I understood. She asked me what I wanted to do. I thought about my father's face in October, the easy dismissal, the way he said context you aren't aware of while his house sat pledged against a failing business his other child had run into the ground. I told her I wanted to handle it properly. No shortcuts. We set a date for a formal meeting with the principals of Holbrook Property Management. The letter went out from my lawyer's office, a downtown Vancouver firm, the kind of address that makes people pay attention. The meeting was framed as a creditor discussion regarding the outstanding line of credit, which was standard language and also true. Nathan called me the night before. He was in a good mood. He'd apparently found out I would be at the meeting. My mother had mentioned it to him, and he wanted to get ahead of it. He said he was glad I was coming, actually, because he had some exciting news. He'd been negotiating a buyout of my father's interest and was close to formalizing his partnership in the company. He said things were turning around. He said the new investor was almost confirmed. He said, "You're going to see a completely different operation when you walk in tomorrow?" I said, "I think you're right." I drove to the office in Kitsilano the next morning. My father was already there. My mother had come too, which I hadn't expected. She sat in the corner near the window with her hands folded, wearing the expression she always wore when she wanted to signal that she was above whatever was happening. Nathan arrived last, which was typical. He was dressed well. He sat at the head of the table. He had printed materials, a presentation actually, with the Holbrook logo on the cover. He started talking about growth strategy. My lawyer looked at me. I nodded. She placed a document on the table, a notice of assignment, identifying me as the current holder of the credit line, and said we should perhaps pause the presentation for a moment. Nathan looked at the document. He looked at my lawyer. He looked at me. I watched the sequence of realizations cross his face. First confusion, then recalculation. Then, and this is the part I will remember, a specific kind of blankness, the look of someone who has just understood that the ground they were standing on was not actually solid. He said, "What is this?" Not a question, just words. My lawyer explained clearly and without drama the credit union had sold the debt. The current holder was a numbered company registered in Ontario. The numbered company was owned by me. My father said, "Serena." I said, "Let her finish, please." My lawyer continued. The debt was in technical default. As the current creditor, I had the right to call the loan. However, I was not here to do that. I was here to discuss options. Nathan said, "You can't. This is the family business." I said, "I know." He said, "You did this to us." I looked at him for a moment. I thought about a lot of things. The lamp, the dinner in Toronto after my convocation, the October conversation. The October conversation. 23 years of my father building something and 4 years of Nathan slowly dismantling it while everyone called it ambition. I said, "Nathan, I need you to tell everyone in this room about the documents you sent to Creston Capital in February." He went very still. My mother looked at him. My father looked at him. He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I opened the folder I'd brought and placed 2 documents side by side on the table. The original bank statement and Nathan's version. Tara had annotated them. She'd circled the discrepancies in red and noted the metadata differences at the bottom. My lawyer said quietly that submitting falsified financial documents to a creditor or investor constituted fraud under the Criminal Code of Canada and could also attract federal charges under wire fraud provisions. My father looked at the 2 documents. He looked at them for a long time. My mother said nothing. For the first time in my memory, she said absolutely nothing. What happened next was not dramatic. That's the thing about real situations. They don't end with speeches. They end with paperwork. I put 2 options on the table. Option 1, we pursue the default. I exercise my rights as creditor, and the matter of the falsified documents proceeds however my lawyer advises. This was the full consequence version. It was available to me. I left it there. Option 2, Nathan resigns from Holbrook immediately. My father transfers operational control to a professional property management firm. I had already identified 2 good ones in the Lower Mainland, and we negotiate a structured repayment plan that allows the business to stabilize without forcing action on the home. I told my father I had no interest in taking his house. I had never had any interest in taking his house. What I wanted was for the situation to stop quietly destroying something he'd built, and for my brother to stop being handed tools he was going to use to hurt people. Nathan said he had rights. His lawyer would look at this. I said that was his choice and we proceed accordingly. My father said, "Nathan, sit down." It was the first time I had ever heard him say that to Nathan in a tone that meant it. Nathan sat down. The resignation was signed before noon. My father didn't speak to me much for the rest of that day. He signed the documents. He shook my lawyer's hand. He walked out to the parking lot and stood there for a while, and I watched him through the window, and I thought about what it must feel like to have to recalibrate everything you believed about your own child. I didn't feel triumphant about it. I felt tired, mostly, and sad in the specific way that comes from being right about something you really wanted to be wrong about. My mother found me in the hallway before I left. She looked different than I'd ever seen her. Smaller, somehow. She said, "You could have warned us." I said, "I tried. In October, you know I tried." She didn't have an answer for that. She looked at the floor for a moment and then she walked back into the boardroom. I drove to my aunt's house in East Van, where I was staying. I sat on her back porch and drank tea and watched her dog run in circles in the yard. She didn't ask me a lot of questions. She knew enough. She'd always been the one in the family who watched things clearly, and I think she'd seen pieces of this coming for longer than I had. She said, "You're going to be okay, you know." I said, "I know." She said, "Are they?" I thought about it. I think they'll figure it out, if they're honest about it. The property management firm took over operations in April. Holbrook is still running. Occupancy rates are up because someone is finally renegotiating contracts and making decisions based on data instead of optimism. My father's semi-retired now. I think he's sleeping better, even if he won't say that to me directly. Nathan moved to Calgary. I don't know exactly what he's doing. We don't speak. That's not a decision I made dramatically. There was no final conversation, no door slammed. He just stopped being part of my day-to-day reality, and the absence of him feels, if I'm honest, mostly like relief. My parents and I have something now that I'm not sure what to call. It's not warm. It's not fixed. My mother asked me last Thanksgiving if I'd wanted to hurt them, and I told her the truth. I wanted to stop something that was already hurting them, and the only way to do that was to be the one holding the mechanism. She didn't say much after that, but she looked at me differently. My father called me in June to tell me that the company was current on its repayment schedule. He said it like he was reporting news. Then he paused and said, "You knew about the house." I said yes. He said, "And you didn't?" I said no. I said yes. He said, "And you didn't?" I said no. I didn't. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Okay, that was it. Just okay." But the way he said it, I've heard my father be wrong before and not acknowledge it, not even close, not even once. That one word was the closest he's ever come. I'll take it. There's a version of this story where I'm the villain. I know that. I bought my own family's debt. I sat on information. I waited. I walked into a boardroom holding a folder that changed everything, and I didn't give anyone a warning. But here's what I've learned. From working in acquisitions for 8 years, from being the person in the room who runs the numbers while everyone else talks about vision, the warning doesn't help. The warning lets people regroup and reroute and come up with new versions of the same story. The warning protects the person who needs to be stopped, not the people who need to be protected. My brother had been warned. My father had been shown the math. The answer was always, "You don't understand." There's context. Not everything is a spreadsheet. Sometimes a spreadsheet is exactly what it takes. I don't know that I'd do everything the same way again. I think about it sometimes. Whether there was a version where I could have reached my father earlier, where he would have listened, where Nathan never got the chance to falsify anything because someone caught it in year 1. Maybe that version exists somewhere. But in this version, the one I actually lived, I needed to be the kind of person my family thought I wasn't. Methodical, patient, willing to wait as long as it took, and then act without hesitation when the moment came. The invisible child sees everything. I've known that since I was 11 years old, standing in the living room, looking at the pieces of my grandmother's lamp on the floor, watching my father turn toward my brother with an explanation already forming before he'd asked a single question. I saw everything. I just took a little longer to decide what to do with it. People ask me sometimes whether I regret how it all played out, whether I should have been louder, earlier, whether the quiet way I handled things was a form of coldness I'm still not fully willing to name. I don't think it was cold. I think it was honest. Here's what I've come to believe. Not because anyone taught it to me in a classroom or because some book told me so, but because I lived it. The consequences of your choices don't disappear just because someone shields you from them. They accumulate, they compound, and eventually they arrive either on your terms or in someone else's. Nathan spent years making choices that were small enough individually to explain away. One bad quarter, one aggressive investment structure, one document that needed to look a little better than it actually was. Each one felt manageable in the moment. Together, they built a situation that couldn't be managed at all. Not by him, not by my father, not by anyone who wasn't willing to look at it clearly. I was willing to look at it clearly. I was willing to look at it clearly. That's the only thing that separated me from them. Not luck, not some particular gift I was born with, just the willingness to sit with uncomfortable information instead of explaining it away. Tara sent me a report in October that said plainly that the company was in trouble. I didn't want it to be true. I flew home and tried to tell my father. He chose not to hear it. That was his right. But choosing not to hear something doesn't make it stop being true. It just means you've given up your chance to respond on your own terms. I think about my father a lot when I think about that. He's not a bad person. He loved his children in the way he knew how, which was imperfectly and unevenly, the way most people love. He trusted Nathan because trusting Nathan felt easier than asking hard questions. That's a very human thing to do. I've done versions of it myself, but there's a cost to choosing comfort over clarity, and my father paid it. In stress, in sleepless months, in the shaky way he looked at those two documents side by side on the boardroom table and understood, all at once, what he'd been funding. What I want people to take from this, if there's anything to take, is that intelligence without honesty doesn't hold. Nathan was smart. He could read a room, tell a story, make something that was falling apart sound like a pivot. But he wasn't honest. Not with my father, not with himself, not with the numbers. And when the numbers stopped cooperating, the only tool he had left was a falsified PDF and a pitch to the wrong investor. Ethics isn't abstract, it's structural. It's the thing that keeps your decisions from contradicting each other in ways you eventually can't explain. I spent years being the one in my family who was told she didn't understand how the real world worked. Turns out the real world is a spreadsheet. It doesn't forgive rounding errors. It doesn't care what story you tell about the numbers. It only cares what the numbers are. I'm not saying any of this was easy. I'm saying it was necessary. And I'm saying that if you're the person in your life who sees clearly, who does the quiet work, who builds something real while everyone around you calls it boring, don't stop. Don't get loud about it. Don't demand recognition. Just keep the folder. Your moment will come.